but not so high that like it gets that glare from behind the window. So got to avoid that. Okay. Gonna get started real soon. Just gonna update that. Need my link, so. I don't have any like cool Halloween music or anything to play in the background. Didn't have a lot of time, as much time to prep for this as, work related things, but oh well, what are you gonna do, right? Oops. Yeah, let's get the chat thing here set up and my notes. I'm gonna need my Bible for a little bit for this podcast too. But hello and welcome to the Stream Parson podcast, an attempt at a Halloween special. And I know it's been a while since I was last here because the last few weeks, I mentioned this on Friday's video, so I'm not gonna go over too much, but one week was really like just intensive stuff, just so busy. And of course, there was Thanksgiving, Canadian Thanksgiving last week, so there was no stream because I had plans that day. And so the other week was just super busy, so I didn't manage to really do anything on that week for the channel. So that's why I've been away for the last little while. I know it's 2 weeks may not feel like a long time. I mean, I guess one of the problems when you're talking about like content on the internet, right? Like 2 weeks is a really long time in that retrospect, right? Because so much can happen with like the propagation of memes and whatever, internet trends and whatever. They move fast, right? I mean, that's one of the things about the internet and what has made it change the world, right? Where basically anything like internet trends, whatever, it's instant and stuff can go by real quick. So 2 weeks can seem like a really long time, right? But for me, right, like when I was busy during those 2 weeks, right, those felt like 2 really long ass weeks. I'll tell you that much, right? Like it felt really, really long. So, but I'm glad to be back. Today, we're going to do a little bit of a kind of Halloween thing. Or at least talk a bit about it. And well, how do I put it this far? Just do a little bit of history about Halloween and some little uh, interesting takes here and there. So that's kind of the plan for today. Don't really have much else for planned out for today, and an actual Halloween kind of like theme thing going. I'm not playing any scary games or anything like that, unfortunately. One, I couldn't find any good ones to really play on the channel and actually have like a good time with it. And one of the things that for me, I guess like the default if you were to do like Halloween themed stuff would be like horror related games, whatever, right? But I'm kind of not the hugest fan of them. I'm not the huge fan of like any kind of horror games, whether like survival or um, well, those are the only real horror type games, right? And I'm definitely not a fan of any gore fest games, so that's definitely out of the question for obvious reasons. But and then of course I'm not very good at survival horror, so that'd be pretty boring to watch me play. And then to try and get like a reaction out of me would be, I don't know. It'd be tough to really do, like for me to do. So I'm sure there's a lot of other streamers out there that can do the horror game thing a lot better than I can, and they're gonna start showing a lot more of their content in the next week, especially next week for sure as we get a lot closer to Halloween. So I don't know if I'm actually really gonna do anything for it. Probably not. Let me just. I'm just looking at my lighting here for a second. It's looking a little bit too bright. Okay, I'm gonna turn it down like this because part of it is that my notes. I'm on a white page this time, so now my screen is also generating a lot extra light than I normally have. So anyway, so that's kind of how it's gonna be for the next little while. I'm still hoping for a more, how do I put it, a proper Halloween podcast, because I'm trying to get my buddy Taki on here. He's been really busy as well, and things have been a little rough for him as of late. So I don't want to pressure him or anything like that. But at the same time, we both really want to do this kind of fun Halloween feature. He is a guy who would know way more than I do, and he wanted to do a fun little thing of like, horror films and the Christian experience, which is kind of a weird thing you wouldn't think about, right? But that's not something I can talk into because I'm not versed in knowing my horror movies very well. Like I watch a few here and there, but I only watch a couple horror movies and only like the classic ones, right? But not so much of like a lot of modern horror movies, and I'm definitely not into slasher films. I absolutely hate slasher films because I mean their whole thing is like the gore for the shock value. I'm not a huge fan of that. If I want to watch something that's quote unquote scary, it's got to have that more like psychological thriller kind of thing, and the more um, supernatural fear kind of story, right? Like you think of like The Ring is a good example. The Japanese version, of course, right? And stuff like that. Like those are alright once in a while for me, but I'm not someone that would be like, oh yeah, like I'm definitely into horror movies, and I would not be like I do a lot of weird connections, right? Like you guys have been around in this channel, you guys know I'm like I explain a lot of my Bible points with like weird comic book and movie references, along with lots of video game references to make sense of, to try and explain the Bible to modern people. That's kind of how I do things, right? But my buddy Taki takes it on a whole new level when he does like horror movies and the Christian experience, and that was gonna be our Halloween presentation, and I'm really hoping that he's able to do it, and we'll have an actual Halloween themed podcast about horror movies and the religious experience. I might as well just kind of mention that because I've really wanted him to do it, but once again, I won't pressure him to do anything that he's not able to do. So we'll see. I'll try and pester him this week for maybe doing it next week. I don't know. I haven't heard from him for the last little while. He's just been so flush with stuff, so it's just kind of how it is. But for what I'm going to do today, I will just kind of give an overview and a little bit of talk about like history of how we understand um, Halloween, why the holiday is celebrated, and some controversies within the Christian world and stuff like that. The more obvious stuff that people may. Well, let me put it this way: it's stuff people should know goes on, but I'm pretty sure a lot of people don't bother to check, even though it's like really easy to fact check this. So like, I would tell you like, don't take my words with a grain of salt, but at the same time, I'm just gonna tell you something that's I'm basically a fact checker. Like, so like I'm reading a fact check, so I'm like I don't have to tell you to go fact checking, right? Because that would be unnecessary, and that's kind of what I'm gonna do for today. So today, talk a little bit about the history of where Halloween comes from, and in a funny way that it is part of the human experience and is even stuff that is common elements of what people celebrate in Halloween is even found in the Bible, which is weird to think, right? But I need to get more of my notes here. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so I'm just opening up. Like, I have a bunch of fact checkers as my notes. Just like I said, it's just a more simple stream and just talk about like knowing, when I'm kind of talking about the history of Halloween. I'm not just like talking out of my ass here, right? Like, I have fact checker on myself just to make sure I'm not like BSing you, right? But anyway, okay, so here we go. So a little bit about Halloween and the history of Halloween. So the modern version of Halloween, I guess you could say, like where we do things in the month of October, and the whole dressing up to as scary things. And the irony is it's kind of this ironic thing where like the idea of Halloween, right? Where the modern idea is where people dress up in scary costumes or whatever, right? And they also put food out, and the whole trick or treat thing comes out of this idea of how to scare away ghosts. It's kind of ironic, right? Because the idea is that like, okay, so people are scared of ghosts and like the supernatural world because they're full of scary monsters and other funky things like that, and the spirit world and all that stuff, right? And so the Celts way back in like, oh gosh, I mean, the earliest documents, although it is more likely it's older than this, the earliest documents would say like, okay, like a roughly 800 AD would be the earliest quote unquote records of the Celts, you know, practicing this tradition to, scare off, demons and spirits, right? But it's way more like that. It's older than this. And so the idea was that the way to scare ghosts and monsters was to dress up like ghosts and monsters. And then of course there's the whole other element of like the appeasing with like food or treats or whatever, right? I mean, in modern version we use like candy or whatever, right? But the idea of like you give food to the spirit world and then they'll like leave you alone or something weird like that, right? And so I mean, if you remember, the Simpsons Halloween special did like a whole joke on this, like this origin of Halloween, where Marge is a real witch along with her sisters, because of course her sisters are, right. And so, um, as witches, they're gonna go to the town of Springfield, and they're gonna go eat the children, or whatever, right? But then, of course, the Flanders, ironically, figure out a way to trick them into not eating their children, but they eat these gingerbread children, right? So Maud has these gingerbread men baked, and they, oh, you can eat these gingerbread children, right? And then the witches eat them. Oh, that's really good, right? Because gingerbread cookies are pretty good, right? So then They're like, okay, that's how we appease, you know, the witches or whatever, and scare them off. Well, not scare them off, but to make them go away, right? And the funny thing is, you know, sure, in like the U.S. and in Canada, we do like Halloween in October, but in a lot of places of the world, actually, there's actually two festivals that basically serve the same. They kind of do the same thing, right? And the other one is like, I think it's like in March or something. Basically, well, there's a reason for this. It's around, I think in Japan they do it in February, but a lot and like between like late February, early March kind of thing. It moves around, you know, lunar calendars, right? It moves around, but it's like late February, early March, and in Asian countries, Japan definitely does this a lot more than like other countries. But they do this. They have a festival. It's called the Festival of the Dead or something like that. In Mexico, they have the uh, they also have something. I'm not gonna try and pronounce its Spanish name because I know I'm gonna butcher it, so I'm not gonna say it. But basically, it's like in May, and they have their own like festival of the dead, right? And a lot of other cultures actually celebrate something like Halloween twice a year. They obviously participate in Halloween like the rest of us, and then they also have one early in the year. And there's a reason for this. At least, you know, since the earliest cultures had always had these beliefs that based on the time of the year and the way that they believe that like the years pass by and the star constellations and all that stuff, right? And certain times of the year, human beings have believed, and the Celts obviously made modern Halloween based on this observation too. And this was kind of, it's one of those things that like you can't really like prove this on paper. One, because you know none of us were around in those ancient times, and two, you know, how do you limit like, or how do you gauge what is like a supernatural activity, right? But basically, most cultures believe that certain times of the year, the the walls between the human world, our world, and the spirit world, they were thinned out during certain parts of the year, and it would happen twice a year. And so, you know, how do I put this? So if we look at like our four seasons, right? Summer, fall, winter, and spring. Twice during that, you know, whole, they would, in the ancient world they called it the equinox. We would nowadays just call it like, you know, the Earth's position to the sun, right? And it's a revolution. Um, Certain times of the year, there was just this belief, and one of the problems is that like you can't really gauge where people got these ideas. They just thought this, and I guess it's one of those things that's like, okay, what do you constitute as a supernatural events, right? Because once again, you know, I think one of the things too is like in our North American culture and our postmodern thinking, we don't really think about like, oh, supernatural events and ghosts and stuff, right? But basically, the belief is that okay, so the walls between the real world and the spirit world were thinned, and so because when they get thinned, they they believe that like okay, ghosts would come into our world, right? Now this is based. They obviously had ideas about how the crossing of the living and the dead world occur, right? Now, if you read a lot of ancient stories, the Bible included, there would be times where naturally, what's the first thing you do when you see a ghost? You freak out, right? And the reason behind the psychology behind this was because if you saw a ghost, the idea was that the ancient people had was that if you were seeing the spirit world, it was very likely you were going to join it. Let's put it that way. And so if you know, you don't want to be seeing the spirit, you don't want to be seeing the spirit world because the idea is that you're going to be joining them soon, and nobody wants that, right? So what they so people develop ideas to like how do you stave off the spirit world, right? I mean that's human, you know, That's human nature and the natural fear of, you know, the natural fear of death, right? Completely rational. And so one of the things that I would poke against if when people would try to make the critique that like, well, the ancient people were so primitive for thinking that way, right? Like to do these celebrations and holidays to ward off the spirit world. But like, you know, in our modern culture, we do we always more or less do something like that, right? Now we don't use the language of like, okay, the living world and the spirit world and trying to ward off the spirit world. We don't really, as modern people, don't really think that way, right? But you think of like how much we've increased in medicine or beauty products and anything like de-aging stuff, and how we bump up what is acceptable as like adults doing kid stuff, right? Or whatever. The idea is that we stave off um, aging, and by staving off aging, you stave off naturally death, right? And so the idea that even to this day we as people do, because once again it's just a natural part of us not wanting to come face to face with our mortality all the time, even though it, I mean, we have to, but on the other hand, you know, you don't want to be gloomy about it, is that, you know, we find ways to not have to face our mortality, right? Better medicine, right? We could be cured of more stuff and whatever, right? Or, you know, um, anti-aging like beauty products or whatever, right? And, you know, all those things. The idea is that you can keep looking young, you can keep being young, right? That way you don't have to worry about, you know, the inevitability of death. And so it's really not that different from the ancient world thinking of, you know, staving off the spirit world kind of thing, right? Which is the fundamental idea of Halloween, and also, you know, the early year equivalent of Day of the Dead, or the 5th of May, or whatever, right? That's the fundamental idea behind it. So that's a little bit of basic history of how Halloween came about. And I mean, I mean, once again, when people talk about like how the Celts came up with like, you know, the whole dressing up and all that stuff, that's not necessarily true, because other cultures have been doing it as well. So it's not like they were the first to do it. And secondly, once again, when people talk about like the Celts did it in like 800 AD, they've been doing it way longer than that. Um, so has everybody else. Because once again, this is the idea of like staving off the spirit world is an idea as old as time, right? Because I'm sure it's been around as long as humans had to deal with their own mortality, which is basically forever, right? So, which is once again, you know, nowadays we just kind of use the dressing up as a fun, you know, fun activity to do, right? And to scare each other and whatever, right? But with the ancient world, you know, their concern was to ward off death, right? Like anyone else. And because they're not like, I guess the way I'm trying to approach it is that in the ancient world, they approached it that way, right? And this is where the festival thing plays another function as well, right? Where it's the community participating in the warding off the spirits kind of thing, right? And once again, this is like, you know, ancient societies and the whole community thing that ancient societies do, right? You know, the whole since the caveman days, you know, you kill an animal, cook it over a fire, and everybody, you know, celebrates and shares stories around the fire, you know, with the animal, right? That's been a thing since the dawn of humanity. And so Halloween was just an add-on to that, where, you know, on the days where people believed that the solstice, the that's what the equinox thing is actually called, the solstice events. So whether it's the October one or the earlier in the year one, with the solstice event, it was just a, you know, an add-on to something people have always been doing, right? Celebrating around a fire, having a community, and overcoming challenges as a community. Now I know, hot take, right? But, you know, like any holiday, right? and Halloween is really the same in a lot of ways. But the whole point of Halloween is the communal aspect. At least it should be, right? And so it's just a reminder that whatever the thing we're trying to face off against, right? Whether it's our mortality in the case of like Halloween, or we're celebrating something more positive, right? Like the chance of redemption at Christmas. That's the real point of it, right? What doesn't matter what the occasion is, right? The idea is that the people come together as community, right? And we address those things together as a people. And so in a way, of course, like you should observe Halloween for that reason, right? And of course, at the same time, you know, it's one of those things that like, okay, human and community should be something that's practiced every day, right? So that's kind of a duh moment, right? Just something interesting to think about. But you know, for the longest time, you know, in the Christian world especially, there have been a lot of like controversy around Halloween because, of course, you know, um, people get too. A lot of people get caught up in the whole scaring people thing, right? And the whole fear elements of Halloween, and it's an excuse to go around scaring people, and it has its place, right? But of course, there is such a thing as taking things too far, like with anything else. You know, you're not trying to traumatize people, but you know, the the community facing mortality together, and you know, fear is a big part of that too, right? And that's that is something that, you know, is part of what we should do, but at the same time, I know there's a lot of like pushback against like, okay, we shouldn't just go out and try and scare our own kids and everything, right? And then of course, you know, when that weird there's the psychology thing too, and that, you know, in the Christian worldview, we view that, okay, I don't have to dress up like a ghost to scare away a ghost, right? And you know, you get exorcist moments, right? Oh yeah, I gotta make a reference to the exorcist, but like, you know, the idea is like, okay, you do the whole like ceremony thing with the holy water and be like, the power of Christ compels you, right? And stuff like that, right? So the Christian idea is that like, okay, I'm not gonna buy. I don't have to think in the superstitious way of like dressing up as a ghost to scare a ghost. I just say the power of Jesus tells you to go away, and I mean, there's truth in that, but with the controversy and what kind of made Christians kind of seem ridiculous during Halloween times, like, oh, we don't observe Halloween, blah 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 blah, right? Is because like I'm not gonna dress up like a demon or a ghost. That's like those are evil things and whatever, right? Which I mean, I guess there's merit to that, but at the same time, you know, going back to the human psychology of things and how do we face, you know, the dark world, right? And, you know, the spirit world and all that stuff. And how do we face those things, right? And of course, you know, the Christian answer would be, well, I have Jesus, so I don't really need to worry about that. And that's true, obviously. But at the same time, you know, going back to the real purpose of Halloween is facing that as a community. Well, how do you do that, right? And it ain't as easy as it sounds. And I'm not trying to encourage your more, um, you know, you don't have to compromise your beliefs. Let's just put it like that when it comes to like, okay, you don't have to like dress up and everything. That's cool and all that. And the other thing too is that like, I know a lot of Christians are hesitant of like Halloween because like, oh, people put up like demonic mask and everything, and that's terror. You know, we shouldn't be doing that. Blah blah blah. And okay, I give you some points of that, and I know some people like quote unquote why I'm a bad Christian, right? Oh, you play video games that have like demons and monsters in it. It's like, wow, yeah, because killing demons and monsters is awesome in a video game. But like, because it is awesome. But like, I get the hesitancy, and I know a lot of Christians may view it very differently. But from my point of view, we cannot escape, you know, certain things that have been part of humanity for so long, right? And so I'm all for like, okay, it's all right to do like the Halloween parties and all that stuff because it's the way that we have the community to face those real fears of death and you know the unknown, right? And that's another thing that makes Halloween interesting is that it tries to make the unknown known. And the other thing that's kind of ironic about Halloween too, right? How's it go, right? It's once you know what terrifies you, then it's really not that terrifying. That's kind of the idea. And so you think of like when people come up with all these different mythologies of all these monsters and whatever, right? And the idea behind it is to put faces on the fear of the unknown, right? Is to give them faces. Because once they have faces, then you know what they look like, you know what they are, and then you can face those things, right? As opposed to the unknown. Well, you don't. If you don't know what it is, then it can surprise you at any time, right? And so there's that element to it as well, and I think that's something that like I know Talkie and I've had this talk when he talk about like horror movies, but then the funny thing too is that that was fundamentally you think of like I'm trying to remember the time period. I'm trying to put an accurate number on the time period, but like that late Victorian period, the late I want to say late 1800s, where a lot of those the what we call the Gothic, different meaning than what it is today, but that like more Gothic literature was coming out. All the monster theme stuff. Like Dracula and Frankenstein and all those kind of stories. And those stories are very interesting because what those stories do is that they teach important moral lessons but use monsters to illustrate those ideas. And one of those funny things when you look back on stuff like that and if you read that kind of literature, which I encourage people should, and I think like for example I would say like Frankenstein and Dracula are both books that everybody should read because they're great books and they're great stories and they teach very important moral lessons and something that the writers were I don't know if the writers were thinking this at the time, but when you look at it now it's absolutely brilliant of what they were doing. Not just them, but all these like writers back then, the late 1800s writing all these horror characters and the whole and one bringing new life ironically to like the these monster mythologies. And something that's interesting is that the point of those stories fundamentally was to talk about various parts, very extreme how do I put it, very extreme like moral lessons, or no, that's not totally accurate, but like moral lessons as well as like understanding the human experience and how the human struggle and what we have to deal with as people, but using monsters to tell the story. And it was actually really brilliant that these writers were doing this, right? Like Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and them, right? And for example, one of the books I'll tell everybody to read, and it's more poignant now. I mean, I'm sure it was absolutely poignant back then, but it's definitely more poignant now than it's been in like a long time. And I recommend to people that like, hey, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley is a book everybody should read. And I'll kind of give you a quick summary of what happens in Frankenstein. So basically, Frankenstein is about well, most people misunderstand that it's really not about the creature, even though he is like one of the main characters. The story of Frankenstein is ultimately about how we judge people and how you and I should judge people. And the fundamental question is, are you merely the product of your creation, or are you a person who gets to define their life? Are you basically the idea is it a nature or is it a nurture thing, right? That's where we get that idea, nature and nurture. So, well, not even that. That's not fully accurate. The way to describe what goes on in the Frankenstein story is like, okay, is it, you know, where you come from? Is it your appearance? Is it like external things that define you? Or is it who you are and what you do that defines you? And so the story of Frankenstein is, well, you have the evil doctor who's really the main character, and he's kind of a terrible human being, right? Well, not by kind of. I mean, he's a really terrible person. And so the town, the people, they absolutely hate this guy, right? Like Dr. Frankenstein, the embodiment of evil in their eyes. And of course, he comes off as a very bad guy, and he's very proud and arrogant, and there's a lot of that, like, Book of Isaiah parallel with Frankenstein and you know Lucifer, where he thinks he's going to be greater than God, right? And because he thinks that, he just does whatever he wants to do. He's a really bad guy. And then, of course, he does succeed in creating life in the Frankenstein creature, and the creature, you know, oddly enough, despite the fact that he's a lab experiment, he believes himself to be a person, and he wants to be a good person. And so he, tries to read the Bible, he tries to help people, but because he's, a monster, you know, people aren't too keen to see him, right? And major spoilers for an over 100-year-old story. But like what happens is at the end of the story, what's really interesting is the mob, they light up Frankenstein's house, and he's trapped. And then the creature comes. He sees that the house is on fire, and he decides to go into it and to rescue Dr. Frankenstein. Not long before, the reason why he was out of the house in the first place was because he got into a big argument with Dr. Frankenstein, and the famous line, "I created you, so I can uncreate you." You know, the the doctor says that, and the creature's like, "No, I'm not bound to you anymore, right? I'm free from you. I don't have to listen to you, right? I'm my own person, and I will make my own decisions and all that." And he walks out in a huff. He's like, "I'm never gonna see you again, right? I hate you, and I never want to see you again, right?" And so the creature walks out in a huff. But then he comes back at the end of the story when the house is on fire, and he decides to save the doctor. Essentially, he saves his father, right? And it's interesting because and of course there's that little Christological elements in the creature as well, where like he gives his life because the creature dies, and as a result, but Dr. Frankenstein lives. The creature, he gives his life for someone who's clearly undeserving, right? And there's a lot of Christian message in that too. In Jesus giving his life to humanity who's clearly undeserving of forgiveness of sins, but Jesus gives his life anyway. And the Frankenstein story kind of parallels this, where the creature gives his life to someone who's pretty undeserving, right? To the doctor. And of course, this is a motif that we find in a lot of stories, right? Because of course, Carl Jung would talk about how, like, well, Christ is the archetype of the, you know, the savior archetype. The savior is the person who gives their life to someone who saves the life of someone. It doesn't have to be gives their life, but that tends to be used, the sacrificing element. But they give their life to someone who's clearly undeserving of it, right? And this is a lot in a lot of stories. I even talked about this back in like my Fire Emblem Three Houses playthrough, right? Because in Fire Emblem Three Houses, Dimitri has that happen, right? Rodrigue Faldarius, he sacrifices his life to save Dimitri, and Dimitri, he was willing to take the punishment and be executed, by an angry little girl for his crimes, and Dimitri kind of just accepted that, like, well, it is what it is, right? I'm a terrible person, and so, but then Rodrigue saves his life, right? and gives and sacrifices his life for Dimitri. And so same thing with the Frankenstein monster, same thing, right? And it's the idea that, you know, what makes us good is that we can give our lives to someone who's undeserving, right? And that's a very Christian idea. And it's interesting once you paint it that way, Mary Shelley telling essentially a Jesus story with a monster, right? And the interesting thing about it, and I think once again, death of the author. So we can't know this for sure, but a lot of people have theorized that like maybe one thing that like these writers were doing, Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley on them, the people who are writing these stories of these old horror monsters, was that we have monsters that have to wrestle with these huge moral struggles that human beings have to. But what's interesting about that is it's not so much a monster issue, right? But the reality is that the scary reality is that we as human beings are not too different from monsters, because you know once again the Christian idea is like, well, if we're full of sin and we do a lot of sin, we are all capable of great evil, and because we're all capable of great evil, then we are all capable of being real monsters, and not just the supernatural kinds in horror stories, but real monsters that can cause atrocities in real people's lives. And so by telling these stories with these monster characters, there's this kind of uncanny nature of like, well, you're not too different from like the Frankenstein monster, right? You're not too different. As a matter of fact, you should see yourself in a lot of ways in these characters. One of what you're capable of as doing evil, right? Because that was one of the things that those writers were trying to really address too, and that they were really talking about, was those elements of the human condition and how dangerous it is, right? And it doesn't take a Dracula, to cause as much harm as he does. It doesn't take, trying to think of another like the werewolf, right? And it doesn't take those kind of creatures, to go around and hurt a lot of people and kill a lot of people, right? Human beings can do that, and of course that was one of the big revelations, if you will, of the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde story, right? Is that fundamentally, right? We are both the person tamed by society, Dr. Jekyll, but we're also the horrible monster of the night that will just follow our hedonistic ways and hurt whoever we have to get it, the Mr. Hyde, right? And the interesting thing about those old stories was that it's like the word I use for it is like, it's a dark mirror for us, right? It's a mirror, but it's a distorted mirror, and it shows it's the mirror. It's a dark mirror in that it shows the darkness within ourselves. That's what it reflects back. And of course, the nihilistic way is like, well, the nihilistic view would just be like, oh well, then what's the point of aspiring to do any good if we're all these terrible monsters inside? But of course, at the same time, the God, for example, the Christian message would be that like, well, there is a way to overcome that, right? And that's through the mercy of Jesus and God empowering us in his forgiveness, and through love that God gives us, then we can overcome darkness first within ourselves, and then we can be a light to the rest of the world, right? But you think of these old Gothic horror stories, and the idea is that like, let's put it this way, one of the problems of modern Christianity is that it's important to talk about how much God loves us, which is obviously true, right? And that's a central part of the Christian message. But sometimes when we don't address like the more darker aspects of the human nature, as the Bible also tells us is true, then God's love starts meaning less, if that makes sense. It starts meaning less when you don't have to contrast it to something else, right? If you just say, okay, God loves people, okay, like, yeah, you know, we all deserve love, so God would just naturally love us anyway, right? That it could lead to that attitude. But if, using the dark mirrors of these horror stories, it would, an important thing to think about is that, like, God could love someone like me, and that and we when we're introspective and we look at all the awful things that we've done and that we're capable of doing, then you ask yourself again, how can God love me, right? And then, as we read through scripture, and it becomes profound that God can love me despite the monster that I am, kind of thing, right? And the monster that you are, right? The fact that God can love us even though we're monsters, and that part is supposed to be profound, right? And that was what the Christian message is supposed to be about, right? It's supposed to be about how, you know, God can love even the worst of us, right? And so, what makes horror stories interesting is that they're meant to be they're meant to be a reminder to us about how terrible we can be, and therefore all the more reason that we need, to be forgiven. All the more reason we need, you know, a savior to save us from ourselves, right? Because I mean that is the scariest monster, is the one you have to face within yourself. But at the same time, when you look at these horror stories, the idea that's also perpetrated is that, like, well, once you understand that in yourself, then you've already put a face to that monster, and then that is how you know you can go up against it, right? Another thing I wanted to kind of talk about, because that's how I really have to talk about that part of the podcast. I had to divide this into two sections. There's no way I was going to keep talking about that one thing for like an hour. This little excerpt here will be excerpts or me retelling parts that I've talked about in various Bible reading streams, which, you guys should definitely check those out too. I do have quite a few playlists. I finally sorted out through the Book of Samuel, so there's a playlist of the Book of Samuel, first and second. And of course I have Genesis. I've done Genesis, Exodus, and I've done Samuel on this channel. I've done a few other like small books here and there as well. Like I think I've done the Book of Ruth on this channel, because that one takes like one stream, right? So I've done like a few. But anyway, I'm gonna bring up something that I brought up in definitely the Book of Exodus for sure, because the Book of Exodus is really the book that addresses this more than any other. Well, no, that's not true. But Exodus does it, in a more blatant way. The Book of Psalms actually draws this quite a bit as well. And I think in the good spirit of Halloween, I wanted to do a little bit, little chat about the character of the Grim Reaper. I have notes for that here, so let's just get that. So the Grim Reaper. So I know what you guys, the image that comes to your mind when you talk about the Grim Reaper, right? Dude in a black cloak, and he's got the scythe and everything, right? And tends to be a skeletal figure. And the idea, like his name, the Grim Reaper. Reaper, on, hilariously, would just refer to like a farmer. So he's like what, like gloomy, or like the dark farmer or whatever. It's kind of a weird thing to think about. But where does this idea come from, right? The Grim Reaper. The modern version of the Grim Reaper that we understand, the dude with the black cloak and the sickle and everything. Most people have probably documented this idea comes from like probably the 14th century in Europe. Now, if you know your history at least decently enough, during the 14th century, the world was hit by probably the biggest pandemic at that time, and that would be the Black Death. Well, the Black Death was basically, this disease that was there was let me more accurately, there was a plague or a disease or whatever that was going around, and it was killing a lot of people, and so the plague got named the Black Death. So there's, you got a little bit of how we should view the words technically. So the Black Death was this plague that basically was killing a huge number of people in Europe. The number supposedly was about 1/3 of the population. Of course, from place to place it varies, but the idea was that 1/3 of Europe was dropping dead because of this plague. And this outbreak went for the funny thing was, in the grand scheme of things, it actually didn't last very long. It only lasted for 5 years or something in Europe during the 14th century. It only lasted for 5 years. But because of the sweeping death that had happened, I mean, 1/3 of people, 1/3 of Europe in 5 years is a lot of people dying, right? And of course, once again, modern medicine, the miracles of modern medicine, right? That we can fight stuff like that and we don't have to worry about diseases wiping people en masse, right? Well, anyway, so when when the Black Death happened, the people were trying to rationalize, or kind of, how do I put it? Put a face, if you will, to this plague that was killing people, right? Because of course they didn't understand the concept of diseases and plagues like we do now, right, in the 21st century. So you have these people back then trying to wrap their heads around, what had happened with this plague, with this Black Death, right? And so they decided to make a character out of this, and this character was the Grim Reaper. Now, of course, the image of the Grim Reaper, there's obviously significance to it, right? Like, why the skeletal figure? Why the scythe? Why the robe, right? Well, the skeleton's kind of obvious, right? It's what happens to the human body once, the rest of the flesh is decayed, right? So there's obviously high association with death when you have a skeleton, right? And of course, we're not talking about one of those science lab skeleton models, right? But basically, when you show a skeleton, the idea was that it is the result of death, right? And the human body is decayed. And then of course, the black robe would be burial ceremony, and people were, in a lot of cultures, people would wear black. Some Asian cultures would wear white, but the idea is that you wear this stock, black or white, and it was used for connecting to the connecting with the dead, right? Kind of idea. So black robe makes sense, right? And then of course the scythe thing, right? Going back to the Black Plague that wiped out 1/3 of Europe. The idea was that the Grim Reaper was reaping the souls of all these people, right? And so the idea was that humanity was being plucked out of the earth. That's kind of the idea that was portrayed through the Grim Reaper character. But of course, once I go through this little bit of history of the modern version, obviously, and you guys see where this is going, and if you've watched my Bible reading streams, you definitely know where this is going. The idea of the Grim Reaper is way older than this, right? It's way older. Because the idea is that, in the ancient world, right? And you find this in all kinds of mythologies. There's always a death god or whatever, right? Where their whole shtick is that they're, you know, they are the instruments of many people's like death en masse, right? And in the ancient world, of course, when people, when people would go to war, they have to represent their gods, right? And there's always a death god among them because, of course, when you're going to go and kill a whole bunch of people, you know, you're obviously doing patronage to your death god, or whatever that might be, right? And so this idea has always been around, right? This idea that, like, okay, there's this we have this being that is the one that's plucking other people from the earth, right? And so having death gods was a common thing in other religions. But then you go, well, hold up, right? What do you do then about monotheistic religions and dealing with the issue of death? And that is a very tough question. It is a very tough question. And some people try to avoid the question altogether because I think in a lot of ways the obvious answers might be quite unsettling. And I did kind of have, and I know some people may find me like a very cynical human being, but I take great glee every time I get to make these references. Whenever I was reading through the book of Exodus and the book of Judges, yeah, Judges is one of the books I did as well. And anytime I get to make the reference, I'm like, okay, well, God has a lot of elements that we find in the Grim Reaper. And I always made the joke that he is the original Grim Reaper. In the monotheistic mindset would be that he is in fact the Grim Reaper, right? So, and there isn't another one, right? It's just only God does it, right? And this idea first comes in actually the book of Exodus. Even though, yeah, there are hints here and there with in the book of Genesis where God blows up Sodom and Gomorrah, for instance, right? So there's obviously instances like that. But this much more eerie, character like the Grim Reaper definitely shows up. This kind of theme shows up in the Bible for sure in the book of Exodus. Now I'm going to get the chapter. I'll just reference the chapter and then I'll just kind of tell you the story. I won't read it to you. You can watch my reading streams for that one. I do have a playlist on the book of Exodus. And it's pretty early in the book of Exodus. It's like chapter 10 or something like that. Nope, it is later in the chapter 10. It is chapter 11 and 12. So if you want to look up where I originally did this joke, it's in Exodus 10 and Exodus. Well, 10 is actually part of it too. So it's in Exodus 10, 11, and 12. Although 10 kind of just sets the stage. So I'm going to use it as a reference. So basically, if you know the Egypt story, if you go watch The Prince of Egypt, which actually does an incredible interpretation of the scene that plays out. So basically, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, right, for 400 years. So Moses is called to be God's instrument to deliver the Israelites from Egypt. And so basically there's this kind of battle, if you want to call it that, between Moses and Pharaoh, where Moses constantly goes like, hey, let my people go. And Pharaoh's like, no. And so every time the Pharaoh says no, God sends a plague onto Egypt, and different things like frogs turning the Nile to blood and all that other stuff, right? Well, eventually we get to the end of the 10 plagues. So plague number 9 is this darkness that falls over Egypt, and it's like, okay, there'll be no light, right? And of course, there's this interesting thing about how in Egyptian culture, Ra, the sun god, was the top of the gods, right? So there's this kind of thematic thing going on there where when God puts this permanent darkness over Egypt for, however long he does it, the idea is that, well, God is showing he's more powerful than the sun god, right? Because he can block out the sun basically pretty easily. And Egypt is like now in total darkness, 24/7. And then there's one more plague to come. And then God tells them, I will kill the firstborn of Egypt. And this is interesting because if he's already beaten the sun god, with the darkness thing in Plague 9. Well, why Plague 10? And of course, Plague 10 is this this in a brutal way, it's a revenge story that God is kind of having revenge for the sake of the Israelites. And there's an interesting contrast, right? Because by killing the firstborn of Egypt, God is kind of doing a revenge against Pharaoh, even though technically it was the Pharaoh's father, but you get the point. Basically against Egypt and the Pharaohs, because remember the Pharaohs saw themselves as gods, so it counts as a battle of gods, if you want to call it that. Where the Pharaoh before the current Pharaoh, we don't, well, yeah, most interpretations would be that the previous Pharaoh before the current one in this story, he was the one who ordered for the execution of the Hebrew babies, all the Hebrew boys for sure, right? And of course that was as early as chapter 1. You know, he first wanted the midwives to start killing the babies for him, and then they wouldn't do it. So then later he made this huge order to go to all these women's houses and have these babies killed, and he would just slaughter Hebrew babies en masse. And then, of course, the famous story of Moses is that Moses' mother puts him in a basket and down the Nile, hoping that he'll survive, which he does, right, by the miracle of God. But anyway, so the 10th plague of Egypt, fast forwarding from, you know, the execution of the Hebrew babies, God is now going to have an execution, if you will, of the Egyptian firstborn. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens in this story. The Bible's text kind of just glosses over it. It just kind of like is assumed. But when you read it at face value, it is a little disturbing. And then one of the weird things that ended up happening was that weird mythologies were born out of it to kind of push away from what the Bible was actually implying. Or not just implying, what the Bible was flat out saying. And so the famous mythology was a character that was developed in Christian mythology called the Angel of Death, or Malthael. And Malthael was the Angel of Death, and his whole business was that he would be the one to go around and do God's work of killing people. That was his whole shtick. That's what makes him the Angel of Death. You can read stories about this guy in like the Pseudepigrapha and other like those other extra Jewish legend books that they obviously had inspiration from the Bible, but then of course because the Bible is ambiguous about a lot of things a lot of the time, then mythologies were made to add on to that. But anyway, that was one of the mythologies that was made, and Malthael was the Angel of Death character that was made. But if you actually just read from the book of Exodus, the darker, scarier reality was that it was God himself who commits the 10th plague, that he himself does it. Which makes logical sense because he did all the other ones, right? So why would he get someone else to kind of do his last bit of work, right? I mean, but anyway, in chapter 11, God pronounces to Moses and says, hey, I'm going to go down. So there's an interesting little bit of wording there, right? Because we read the other 9 plagues, there's this kind of like implication that God is kind of just sitting at a distance, and he uses like some other means. He magically casts a spell or whatever, you know, for your gaming illustration, or whatever, right? You know, he casts a spell or something, and then he sends it into the world, but he himself is still separate from it, if that makes sense, right? So he summons a bunch of frogs, but he's not there with the frogs, right? He just summons the frogs, right? He summons the hail, but he's not there throwing hail balls, right? He summons, you know, the gnats, but he's not there with the gnats. You get what I'm getting at here, right? But the 10th plague is different. With the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn of Egypt, God says, I will go down. So the implication was that he was going to actually be present and do this, this thing that he's about to do, go kill a whole bunch of Egyptians, right? And so and I know that's probably why the Malthael mythologies were invented, because that's pretty disturbing, right? Every other thing that caused all this destruction to Egypt, God was still kind of separate. He's still like, he's sitting back, and then he just like summons it, but he doesn't actually do it himself in that sense. But here, it's very different. In chapter 11, where God's telling Moses, he's going to go down and he will be the one to execute, judgment is the word used, but you know what he's getting at, right? Like, he's going to go and kill the firstborn of Egypt, that he himself is going to do it. And of course, there's that weird thing that for Christians and, well, anyone really, to wrap their heads around. It's like, okay, so God is going to have a physical presence and do this, which only makes it more disturbing, right? And so, because God is going to do this himself, and the other implication that he's in a bad mood, right? Which leads to the next part, which sounds like it's really bizarre once you put the chapter 11 context in it, and you read the next chapter, in chapter 12, is where God instructs Moses how to do the Passover, right? Which is funny because the Passover is celebrated around the same time as, a lot of those Eastern cultures' Days of the Dead, which is hilarious because that's where we also do our modern Easter, right? And once again, this goes back to the whole solstice thing. There's a time with the spirit world in October, and there's one earlier in the year, usually like March, right? And so there's that, the Halloween element, if you want to call it that, in the book of Exodus, where God has, since he is directly entering into the world in that story, right? He's not just, summoning, stuff to do his bidding. He is going down and he's going to, kill the firstborn of Egypt. And so, because of this, that's why he tells Moses, you must follow these instructions very, very carefully, or else, you might get caught up in my wrath, basically, is what he's getting at. Because now that God has entered the fray, if you will, you kind of have to think of it as like, he's in berserk mode, right? Like guts in berserk, right? And I mean, obviously there's that inspiration there too, right? But basically, that's why God tells Moses to do the Passover specifically, and the blood on the doorpost was so important, right? Because then the way God would view the blood is that blood has already been spilled, so I don't have to kill anyone here. But anyone else, you're in the way, you're getting cut down, basically. Which, once again, when describing God this way does make it kind of disturbing, right? And that's what, once again, where a lot of even Christians made up these mythologies that like, oh, God didn't do it, he sent the angel of death to do it. But then you run into other problems as you read through the book of Exodus. So that's why it doesn't work. So that's, God being the Grim Reaper right there. He's going down and he's just like killing people left and right. Kind of like the Black Plague, just killing people left and right, right? The Black Death, sorry. The Black Death killed people left and right. And then, in the Egypt story, God killing people left and right. Now, for those of you, you should probably look at this video after you watch this. Because I'm honestly not going to play on my channel because I don't want to get caught for copyright. I'm not ready to any of the kind of those problems. But in the Prince of Egypt movie, there's this great scene, right? Where it's supposed to be the whole, like, 10th plague scene, right? God comes as his, like, he's supposed to be in the mist. And the mist is an interesting thing, too, which I'll bring up later. But God travels in this mist. And you don't see God. You just see the mist move, right? And so the mist moves through Egypt, and then, like, it goes into a person's house, and then the metaphor that the movie uses is actually very powerful. And this, once again, brings up how God could also be the Grim Reaper idea, and it works really well when you use this understanding, and it makes sense. It makes logical sense. The idea is that, fundamentally, what makes it work that God is also the Grim Reaper is that if God is the giver of life, he is by transient of properties the taker of life, right? Because only God has that real power, right? Ultimately, of life and death, right? And so, in the Prince of Egypt movie, okay, before I talk about the Prince of Egypt movie, we got to backtrack a bit with the life and death thing, right? So, when we talk about when God gave life to human beings in the book of Genesis, well, how does God do it? He breathes life into humans, right? You read in Genesis 2 that he breathes life into humans, and then that's how, they came to be. Now, in the Prince of Egypt movie, the way that he's death is that he takes the breath, and you always hear like the person do this like final exhale, and then God is taking the breath out of them in that moment, and then they die, right? And so that's how he does it in the movie, right? Which is a very powerful metaphor, and it makes logical sense when you're doing God as the Grim Reaper metaphor in the movie. So the Prince of Egypt movie did it first, okay? So I'm not the only. For those of you screaming heretic at me of like, oh, Michael saying God is the Grim Reaper, I'm not the first to do it, okay? DreamWorks did it first. Heck, DreamWorks didn't even do it first. That old classic Ten Commandments movie also kind of used this metaphor, right? And the cloud thing is interesting for its own reason, but we'll get to that shortly. So basically, yeah, God enters into, the land of the Egyptians, and he kills them. He basically does it himself, and he goes in person to do it, right? As opposed to the other plagues where, once again, the summoning illustration, right? He's like a wizard summoning the plagues, but in the 10th plague, he's not like that. He goes into it himself, and he he kills the Egyptians himself. Which I know is like really disturbing. But hey, this is a Halloween stream, so we get to be a little disturbing, right? That's part of the fun of Halloween, right? I have an excuse to be a little disturbing. To be fair, I don't need Halloween to be disturbing. Anytime I read the Bible, I can be disturbing, because the fact of the matter is the Bible deals with really disturbing stuff, because the real world is disturbing, and you just have to deal with it, right? Because of course the other thing that the part of the human experience is either you confront things that are disturbing, or you cower away until it corners you, right? So which way you want to go about it, right? But anyway, back to the Prince of Egypt story. God is the one who does the whole Grim Reaper thing, and then that is what makes Pharaoh break, right? And there's that interesting metaphor in there too, right? It's when God was being Mr. Wizard, summoning the plagues, Pharaoh was still very hard-headed and hard-hearted, right? Saying, refusing Moses and refusing God. It was only when God enters the situation himself and does the whole Grim Reaper thing, then Pharaoh breaks. That's what breaks him, right? And then Pharaoh says the Israelites can go. But then, of course, Pharaoh changes his mind, and then he chases after Israel, which then, the interesting thing is, God once again does the whole Grim Reaper thing again, right? So, and then he kills more Egyptians, right? And then, with the water thing and all that. And so there's that scene as well. Now, the interesting thing is that this plays a huge part in how we then read the Ten Commandments, right? Which I talked about in the last podcast too, when I talked about the lying commandment, right? When we talk about the Ten Commandments, and you have to keep the Grim Reaper thing in mind when you read the beginning of the Ten Commandments, right? Because how does God begin the Ten Commandments, right? And you read it when it starts in Exodus 20, and God said these things. And the first thing is, I am the Lord your God who delivers you out of the land of Egypt, right? So the interesting thing that a lot of Bible scholars point out, so I'm not so brilliant to come up with this myself, obviously, but as every Bible scholar knows this, is like, okay, that's an interesting way for God to address himself, is that he addresses himself as Israel's deliverer. And I talked about in my Exodus streams why he does that, right? Using the Frankenstein illustration again, he doesn't do the Dr. Frankenstein thing. He doesn't say the whole like, well, I made you so I can unmake you, right? God doesn't identify himself as their creator, even though that would be a solid reason to be like, okay, I am your creator. You should listen to what I say. He doesn't say, well, I am, the creator of the universe, right? I'm so powerful. You better do what I say, right? He doesn't do that. What he does is he addresses them for what he did, like in the immediate moment, right? That he was the one fighting their battles against Egypt. That's how God identifies himself, right? And then you have to look back on the plagues and ultimately the 10th plague, where he himself entered the scene as the Grim Reaper. And so that is what predicates the rest of the commandments. And of course, there's other elements of like, well, he's a war, God being the warrior type and all that stuff, right? And the fact that a guy who, can pluck life like that is then telling Israel how to live, right? And of course, the parallel with Jesus and the resurrection within the Exodus story is that human freedom came at a high price, right? And so that's the other thing a lot of people, like, they kind of ignore and they try to get around, like, oh, God shouldn't be so violent or whatever, right? If he's God, if he's so loving, if he's so good, then he shouldn't need to resort to violence. But at the same time, the point when you read the Exodus story or even the resurrection story with Jesus, the fundamental thing is that freedom, first from like oppression in the Israelites case and freedom from sin in the Jesus case, they fundamentally come at a high price, right? And that was, that predicates all the rest of the commandments. And you read that in light of, going back to the 10 Commandments, you read that in light of the plagues of Egypt. And the interesting thing is you keep reading through the book of Exodus, and I've pointed, go watch my series. I point this out, that God, for some reason, he keeps that identity going. The scarier, Grim Reaper image. He keeps that image up when he's providing for and fighting Israel's battles for them, right? Because of course, at this point, the Israelites are a bunch of, well, they're Hebrews. They're not even Israel yet, but the Hebrews are walking around in the desert. They're nomads with no direction, right? Completely, like outmatched in military power compared to everyone else around them, right? So God has to keep fighting their battles, and so he keeps up this, the traditionally we would say like his more warrior character, but his warrior character is also the freaky Grim Reaper. And the Bible even plays at this idea that he very well looked like the Grim Reaper, because in a later chapter, I can't remember what chapter it is exactly, there's this funny moment where after God tells Moses how to set up the tent of the tabernacle, there's these moments that the Bible tells about where God visits Moses in a tent, and he always shows up in this black cloud, right? You gotta see where I'm going with this, right? So he always shows up with this black cloud, and then the Bible would describe it that when God appears, the black cloud sits over the tent, and then the Israelites are like praising and singing worship to God, and also scared now their pants out, which is a reason why they have Moses talk to God and not they themselves do it. After all, the Israelites did tell Moses, you talk to God for us, because if we talk to God, we'll be obliterated by his holiness, is basically the way they say it. And so Moses is the one who has to, he's the one who talks face to face with God. And the funny thing that the Bible tells us, that every time this happens, God appears in this black cloud, and then the cloud would sit over the tent. And then every time God leaves, the cloud then moves, right? And of course, the whole joke that God is also the cloud monster. But the joke I was making in my Exodus readings was that God basically has this image of the Grim Reaper here, right? The cloud is black too, which the Bible tells us, right? So my heretical statement, quote unquote, I have enough basis to make this claim, right? The the black cloud is it can be viewed as if it's like his cloak or something, right? It's a big black cloak, just like you know who, right? Like it coincidence? I think not, right? And so it's kind of funny like that, right? Where there is this idea of like, God being the Reaper is not really that far out there. And of course that's how the monotheistic worldview just has to accept that, like, well, God is both, right? He is the giver of life and he's the taker of life. And unfortunately, when he's the taker of life, it's a scene you don't want to see, right? I mean, the Israelites were scared out of their minds, right? That's why, and that totally makes way more sense when you read those passages, right? When the Israelites are like, Moses, you talk to God, because we can't go near God, right? And no doubt, the Israelites were thinking, Grim Reaper, because that is the only way they knew God, right? Of course, the law, when God brought the law, was kind of to remind them that, like, well, I'm not only, the terrifying figure I'm also your protector. I'm also someone who has your interests at heart. I'm also someone who's kind and I'm generous. I show love. I'm not just the scary Grim Reaper, right? And that was the big part of the law, was God explaining that to the Israelites. How well they went with that is a completely different story, right? But the funny thing is that when you read through the book of Exodus, you actually get that more scarier idea of God. And, anytime I get to make that reference is always a joy to me. And retelling this story much more formal fashion like this, as opposed to just like pointing it out when it happens in the Bible, which, I get a hoot every time I do, right? Because you think of, I guess this will be our closing amble, because I'm kind of done for like talking about Halloween things, and I probably scared you enough with like a more scary reading of like the book of Exodus, or reading in a more scary fashion, if you will. But one of the funny things is that, like, God uses this image quite a bit, right? Because you read in the book of Psalms, and I can't remember the Psalms exactly. I should have looked up exactly which parts. But I remember I was having a funny talk with someone on Facebook, and we were talking about, like, there was this one passage where, like, God is described as the killer of gods, right? And then the guy was making a joke about, like, well, sorry, Kratos, but God beat you to it. But it's like, well, of course he did, because, the Bible also shows God as the Grim Reaper, which would be the killer of all things, really. Right? So there's that. And then, of course, in the book of Kings, Elijah, he invokes that image of God, right? And I talked about this in one of my more recent streams, right, where Elijah invokes that image of God, when he's asking God to take his life, and he's invoking the Grim Reaper side of God. But of course, the twist in the Elijah story is that he doesn't do it, right? God instead comes as the caretaker that we all need him to be more often than not, right? In our miserable lives, we desire God to be the caretaker more often than he is the Reaper. And so that's what God does for Elijah, right? He shows up as the caretaker, and he cooks for him, and gives him a place to sleep, right? And it's a very powerful image there. But of course, one of the big problems with modern readings of the Bible, where people, I don't just tell you to, like, use the image of the Grim Reaper with God just to scare you, or like to act hot takes and anything. But when you read the Bible more honestly that way, one, and two, when you see that kind of the terror of how evil fears God, and then you contrast that to how loving God is, right? It makes both of them far more profound, right? how serious, God finds sin an offense, right? That he's basically the Grim Reaper, or how loving he is when he cares for us, right? And those two things, they highlight each other. Because one of the big things that's kind of dissatisfying you see in a lot of modern Christians is that you downplay the whole darker side, the scary side of God, if you will. And then it's like, okay, then he's just some kind of loving hippie, right? More sex, more drugs, kind of like hippie cult Christianity, which unfortunately is what's been plaguing a lot of churches nowadays, right? Okay, maybe not to that extreme. I don't know if your church promotes like free sex and drugs, there's a serious problem. But you get the idea, right? Like God is downplayed as opposed to he's the terrifying warrior and he's the terrifying reaper. But he's also, that just makes him being the loving father all more profound. So now I'm going to give you all nightmares about like that scene in the Prince of Egypt and like the Grim Reaper doing this Prince of Egypt scene. I'm going to give you all nightmares for a week because I told you that story. So no apologies in advance because this is probably going to be awesome. But like, in all seriousness though, you guys really, I encourage you to read through the book of Exodus, with that lens in mind. And, maybe that'd be a fun thing, right? Just like, you don't have to do a horror, to my Christian buddies out there. They're like, what can we do for Halloween? Instead of like, slasher films, which I don't encourage, right? Just read the book of Exodus with like that darker tone in mind and like do it around a campfire and marshmallows. Like that would be that sounds like a great Halloween event actually, right? Bunch of kids in their little Halloween costumes, have some hot cocoa or s'mores around a campfire, something like that. And just read the book of Exodus, because that's a great Halloween story right there. So, anyway, this is going to be the end of the podcast, because it's already 5:30 now. I've been going for an hour and a half. And I had a, fun time just talking a little bit about some Halloween things and rocking my socks off with like the Grim Reaper analogies in the Bible. So that's always fun, because I always have a grand old time doing that. But with that said, this is going to be the end of the podcast. Just do a little bit of housekeeping, although there's really not much to keep or to do for housekeeping. So basically Thursday, we have Throwback Thursday videos with Heroes of Might and Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty, just as usual. And Friday, we'll be starting Second Kings. So I hope you guys are excited for that and to read through the book of Second Kings with me as we study through that one together. Anyway, I know it's only like the 18th, so I can't really do like a happy Halloween yet because, I mean, it would be more appropriate to do that closer to the day, but I'll do it anyway. Happy Halloween. This was an attempt at a Halloween stream anyway, but happy Halloween. And I hope you guys, take care of yourselves. Safety is important. Don't do anything illegal, because, there's always people that are tempted to do that, right? Because Halloween, people just do whatever they want, right? It's a risque night, which is another way of like, the spirit world thing, right? I mean, that's one way to get close to the spirit world, I guess, doing dangerous illegal things. So it's like, you think that like the point of Halloween, the original point, is like to stave off the spirit world, and now people are doing things to get themselves closer to it. But I mean, you do you, I guess. Wouldn't think it's a good idea, but anyway. Oh, that was a terrible joke. Anyway, and that was forced. But anyway, hope you guys have a great rest of your week. I will see you guys on Thursday for Throwback Thursday. And I hope to see you guys Friday, Bible reading, beginning Second Kings, and that will be at 3 o'clock Pacific time. Anyways, you guys have a great rest of your night. Happy Halloween on the 18th of October. And God bless you.